Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Emma Crofts. I work as a flood resilience engagement advisor for the Environment Agency, and my specialism, as the name suggests, is in flooding. So this follows on quite nicely from the weather patterns, etc., that Mark has been talking to you about just a short while ago. So just looking a bit about flood risks in London. I'm sure most of you will recognise a map like this. These are all the rivers, tributaries of the Thames and the main rivers that pass through London. There are many and varied sizes and types of rivers that run through the capital, and a lot of the risk that people perceive is associated with the Thames, but actually the flood risk in the capital more often than not comes from those smaller rivers, places like the Beverley Brook, the Brent, and the Lee, etc., that actually join the Thames. Those rivers can be more reactive to rainfall than the larger Thames, which takes a lot longer to actually rise in level than those smaller rivers do. And Mark mentioned about the cycle of storms we've seen this winter, and our catchments are largely saturated at the moment. That does mean they do react more quickly to further rainfall. But as I mentioned, the Thames takes that bit longer to rise because the headwaters come all the way down from Gloucestershire. So it's just something that we are acutely aware of in the Environment Agency this year, is that our rivers could react more quickly. Obviously, there's the tidal Thames as well that runs all the way up to Teddington, and I'm sure most of you will be aware that we have lots of gates and defences associated with the Thames, particularly the Thames Barrier, if anyone's ever been up to the Charlton Way of the World and seen that, that actually protects the capital from tidal flooding. There are still locations around the capital that do flood on a high tide. They tend to be very, very close to the river. They tend to be low-lying, and people tend to know exactly where they are. Some of those key places around Putney Bridge, Teddington, places like that. But we do issue flood warnings and flood alerts for those locations. So I will touch on how to sign up for those shortly. The other thing to be aware of in the capital are things like groundwater flooding. That can be an issue, particularly in the south of London, around those South London boroughs. But the underlying geology means that those areas can suffer more so with groundwater flooding. That tends to be at the end of a very wet winter, tends to be in a wet spring, and we saw that happen in the spring of 2014 after we had a particularly wet winter in 2013. Just one other type of flood risk to mention, although it's not under the remit directly of the Environment Agency, is surface water flooding. And I'm sure people will recognise pictures like this all over the capital. Surface water flooding tends to be more of a risk in the summer, tends to be less of a winter risk, but we can still see those heavy, intense storms in the winter, and we can still see some level of surface water flooding associated with those storms as well. So it's just something to bear in mind. With regard to managing flood risk, the Environment Agency manage the tidal defences along the Thames in conjunction with partners in some places. We also look after the main rivers that run through the capital that I showed you in the first map, and we support our partners, the London boroughs, as the lead local flood authorities to manage flood risk and groundwater risk in the capital. So just a quick look at the impacts of flooding, and I'm just going to give you a few quick headlines that will hopefully put minds to thought about preparing for flooding. So we currently estimate that we need to invest around £1 billion every year in flooding over the next 50 years to keep reducing the risk. And we estimated that in the 2015-16 floods that we actually saw in more to the north of England, there was £1.6 billion worth of damages in one winter set of floods, which is a huge amount. But if we break that down a little bit, because those are big numbers, I appreciate. Resilience isn't just about structures. It's not just about the defences that we put in place. It's about the fabric of a community and the resilience that you can put in place as an individual. It's all about communities coming together, supporting each other, as I know you all do, giving people a sense of self and helping to protect their mental health during incidents as well. And our research has shown that for every individual who gets directly affected by a large flood, around 16 more suffer from those knock-on impacts, such as the loss of utilities and services. So the reach is far more than those who get physically flooded. So even if your community may not be directly at flood risk, there could be a knock-on impact to your community for all the things that go on around that. And the average domestic payout by the stats given by the Association of British Insurers is around £50,000 for the average home in a flood, and more than 50% of businesses that ever flood will fail in the year following, provided they haven't put any of their resilience measures in place. And the mental health impacts of flooding, I think, really also need to be considered. In monetary value, the mental health impacts are around £3,000 to £7,000 per flooded household, depending on the scale of the flooding. But if we look at that outside of a monetary assessment, we're looking at people suffering from anxiety, depression, stress, isolation, and 36% of people who flooded were still suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder 12 months on, and 24% still suffered 24 months after that. So we will have communities that have been affected by flooding in the capital who will still be struggling with those effects, those mental health effects of flooding, even if they've been able to put their lives or their homes or their businesses back together. So it's something to bear in mind, those impacts. So what can we do about it, essentially? So there's a number of things that we do in the Environment Agency to try and promote resilience and preparedness around flooding. And I'm going to touch on each of these in turn. You'll notice I'm not big on lots of words on slides. I'm more about the visuals. So if we think about awareness first, anything we can do to promote awareness. So sessions like today are super important. We also look to raise awareness through champions in communities. So if you can talk to members of your community about what you found out today, that is a really big help. We also do work on local campaigns and bigger national campaigns. So next week is the start of London Flood Awareness Week. So there'll be lots of information coming out via social media through the GLA, so the Mayor's Office, and through your London Borough partners as well. So something to think about is just following, if you can, some of those messages and sharing those into your communities so people can pick up those hints and tips and awareness. And the week after that will be the National Environment Agency Flood Action Campaign, which will be kicking off on the 20th of November. And again, if you can share all of those things, that's fantastic. And shortly I'll put a little note in the chat about where you can follow some of those messages. But basically watch out for things like #FloodAware or #LDN FloodAware, because those are the messages that we'll be pushing out to help people check their flood risk. Mark touched on warnings for the Met Office. It's super helpful. So thank you, Mark, for touching on warnings there. And I will give the Met Office app another plug in a short while. But just to plug our own at the moment, we do provide free flood warnings for as many places as we possibly can around the country that suffer from flood risk. It's a really important tool to help people be aware and prepared for an increase in the level of flood risk. Mark from the Met Office mentioned that 5-day forecast. That's super important to keep an eye on. But when we think that something is going to be happening and we predict that flooding can occur, we will issue those warnings directly. So if you're not already signed up, please, please, please do consider signing up to receive alerts and warnings in your area. You can do it really quickly on gov.uk. It takes around 2 minutes. All you really need is your address and your phone number. And if you can't find warnings for your address, you can search by your nearest town. So please do consider doing that. If you do get stuck at any point and you can't get a registration to load, please do consider phoning our floodline, and I'll pop the number up for that on the chat at the end, but it's on the bottom of the slide there as well. The other thing to think about is how you can be the eyes and ears in your community. And I know a lot of you already are, but something just to think about is if you see a problem, report it. Report it as soon as you can. If there's something you think that could cause or make flooding worse, report it as soon as you can. We can get somebody out there to look at it, assess it, and get any necessary action taken before it becomes a problem. So if you do walk locally through your local park and you walk through a watercourse and you see typically a mattress, a sofa, that kind of thing we often find, please get them reported as soon as possible and spread the word to others to get these things reported to us as well. And you can report them on either of the numbers on the bottom of the screen there, and they will get to the right place. There are things you can also do to help your community prepare. We have lots of information out there to help communities prepare for flooding. There's lots on the gov.uk pages, and we can share with you templates, guidance, all sorts of things to help that happen. It doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a geographical community that are preparing for flooding. It could be that you have a faith community, a community around a school, a residents association, any of those things. Thinking about developing a really simple plan. What's the risk for your area? What do you know? What actions are you going to take? What assets do you have in your community? And people are definitely assets. Do you have people living in your community that could help during an emergency? Are there people with vehicles that could help vulnerable people? Thinking about your local safe space, and we touched earlier on about warm welcome spaces, and actually are those the sorts of places that could be used in an emergency, in a flood? Would your neighbours need any help? Are you able to help them? And your personal preparations as well. So thinking about what you could do, whether you live on your own or you live in a household of multiple people or a family group, thinking about a simple flood plan. It really is 1 or 2 sides, and all it does is just set out what you're going to do if there's a flood in your area. And that could be if a flood is predicted or if a flood actually occurs. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? It's so easy to forget things in an emergency when the panic can set in. What about your medication? Do you know where it is? Do you know where your repeat prescription is? If you do end up having to go to a humanitarian aid centre or a rest centre, if you turn up, it's much easier if you've got your repeat prescription to get your medicines re-administered to you. Do you know what you're going to do with any animals that you might have? You might want to consider an emergency grab bag just to keep with you, just in case you do need to leave your home at any time. And think about checking what your insurance covers you for as well. Surprising number of people who find that when they get into any kind of emergency, their insurance doesn't necessarily cover them for all the things they thought it did. So now is a good time to think about checking that, think about what you can do ahead of time. And there are things that you can do to protect your property as well. So this is just an example of the things that you can do. That's a flood board on the screen that you actually fit to your doors, but they can be a lot bigger. There are really simple products out there that you can actually use to protect your property from flooding. Simple things like non-return valves, bungs that go in your toilets to stop your drains surcharging into your house, and bigger things like putting flood guards across your doors, checking your air brick covers. Water is inherently lazy, and it will find the easiest way to get to where it's going. And if that's straight through your house, then that is what it will do. So think about where those places might be that could be vulnerable to water getting in. Some communities work together to identify and fund local defence measures like a sandbag store and things like that. So it's just something to think about that you could do personally to your property, or that you could do with the community, or speaking to your housing association, or speaking to your local landlord as to what could be done on your property. And then the last thing, I guess, to consider really is around recovery. The final part of this journey, if you are unlucky enough to find yourself in a flood situation, is that recovery. And it's easy to underestimate how long that can be. People can be out of their home 3 to 6 months. I've known people who've been flooded by groundwater that was around for 3 months, and they were out of their home for over a year. It's incredibly disruptive. It's incredibly stressful. And thinking about how you could recover, how you could help your community recover and stay in touch with people and help with that isolation could really make a big difference. What could you do to help to get your community and yourselves back on your feet sooner rather than later? There's just a few places there to find more information, useful sources of weather warnings or templates and plans you can download. They're all really useful spots. And I will make sure that Emily has those to share with the group afterwards as well. But just a few places to get some help. On gov.uk/flood, there's everything you could possibly think of. The 5-day forecast is there. You can sign up for flood warnings there. You can download a personal flood plan, a community flood plan. You can find out how to protect your property from flooding. London.gov.uk has lots of help and advice as well. So I suggest checking on their website. And there's just a couple there around the Flood Hub, which is absolutely brilliant. National Flood Forum, which is a charity that supports communities at flood risk. And FloodRe. And FloodRe is around flood insurance. So if you are struggling with flood insurance, you can get in touch with FloodRe to give you some help, support and advice. And hopefully that's been helpful. And I will be around for the Q&A as well.